That's too much before you do your
No, it's not. It's okay.
Standing all day,
Yeah.
I deserve to sit.
Not having places to sit.
Okay, is anybody not ready? Okay. Okay, so, hi, I'm Camon, for those that don't know me. So I am, I'm a hobbyist, semi-professional editor, enthusiast, yeah. So I'm a software developer as my day job. I'm a computer engineer by education, but I've always been interested in video and film. And I've always been a very behind-the-camera kind of person. I've always been very interested in editing and some of the more technical aspects of filmmaking. And so today we're just going to be doing basically an overview of film and video editing. And editing is a really big topic, and there's a lot of different aspects to it that you can dive into. So today my goal is basically just to give sort of an overview of things that you can be thinking about when you go about your editing. And my intention here is not to give you any like a super in-depth dive about any one topic, but rather to sort of give you sort of a broad perspective on sort of the different things that you might be inclined to look into, just things to think about. And, you know, if you find something that's interesting or that you want to know more about, there can be, I'll try to give you some resources for research. And if anyone has any questions at any point, if something's not clear, feel free to speak up, because we can do this as sort of a conversation as a Q&A as well. I'll take questions at the end, but also don't hesitate to, you know, speak up if there's something that's not clear. But yeah, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. My start here, we're going to talk about what is editing. We're going to start with sort of the textbook definition. This is the definition that I have thought up for myself. What I think of editing as is, in the context of film and video editing, we're talking about assembling individual visual and auditory elements into a coherent sequence, a coherent video or film from all of its individual components. And an important thing to know about editing is that it is both a technical and an artistic endeavor, because you can spend a lot of time researching the technical aspect of, okay, but like, how do you do the editing? What software do you use? What settings do you use? How do you use the software? How do you assemble everything? You know, there's a lot of research that can be done into the technical elements of just like, you know, practically how do you do this? And then there's also the artistic aspects of how do we use our editing to tell a better story, to serve the story, and to convey additional information to the audience that we want to convey to them. So we're going to be talking about both today, both the technical and the artistic elements of editing. And editing is really an essential part of post-production. It's something that is unique to filmmaking and videography. You know, there's audio editing, and there's, you know, text editing, and there's you know, of course, live productions that have much less, you know, editing to them. Those are generally just live cuts. But when you're talking about narrative filmmaking, editing is really essential, and, you know, film doesn't happen without editing anymore. Even, you know, in the silent film era, you know, you could have just a single shot and that would constitute a film. But, you know, nowadays, film doesn't happen without some form of editing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the software and the tools that we have available to us to do our video editing. So to start with, we're going to differentiate between some of the older tools that might have been used back in the day for editing versus what we have available to us nowadays. So in the early days of film, editing basically involved physically cutting and rearranging bits of film or tape. And that's why it's called a cut, because they would literally cut the film and then take another bit of film and paste it on the end. So that's how it started. And then, you know, very quickly we started to see machines that would, you know, streamline the process. But these machines were still pretty much linear. You know, you could, you know, play through a bit of film, you could rewind a bit of film, you could cut it and splice something else in, but, you know, generally you're still dealing with just a linear sequence of frames. You can go forward and backward and then cut and paste around. But editing was still relatively limited compared to what we have access to today, because nowadays basically everybody uses digital non-linear editors, and these are basically this is editing done inside the computer. So rather than our editing being done on a physical bit of media like a videotape or a film strip, everything just exists in the computer's memory as digital data. And then because everything is just digital information, that gives us a lot of flexibility to do things that wouldn't be possible or practical editing on physical media. We can do lots of sort of non-linear workflows and techniques with digital editing that we couldn't do before. Yes, everything stays on the computer, unless you're Christopher Nolan, who likes to still edit on film for some reason. But almost everybody uses digital editors these days. Even if a movie is shot on film, they still use digital for editing. So, for the most part. So, in terms of software, we've got there's tons of different editing software out there, right? But the big four that most professional or semi-professional editors are going to be working with are these four. And we're going to talk about each of them, not in super great detail, but just sort of give you an idea of what's out there and what some of the pros and cons of each might be. So those are Avid Media Composer, Final Cut Pro, and Adobe Premiere Pro, and DaVinci Resolve. So Avid Media Composer is a software. It was first released in 1989, and it's been kept fairly up to date since then. It's still actively developed by the company that makes it. And Avid is really the industry standard for high budget productions. If you start to look at, like Hollywood level studios, film and TV, basically they're all using Avid. And that's just because Avid was pretty early on the scene of nonlinear editing. This was back before it was just like a software you could install on your Windows or Mac. It was a dedicated machine that you would buy, and it's just really sort of stuck around and evolved with the time since then. It is pretty expensive. It's like $40 a month, and it's a subscription. So it's kind of a lot of money. And I've never used it. So I've wanted to learn Avid many times, but I've never felt that it had enough to offer me that I've wanted to switch. But I wanted to make everyone aware of it because, in the high-end space, this is what everyone's using. You can have a debate over whether they use it because it's the best or if they use it just because it's what they've always used.
Everybody uses it.
Yeah. So,
how easy end user wise? I know you've never used it, but
Yeah.
have you heard the usability, the
Yeah.
end user kind of?
I've installed it before. In terms of accessibility, it doesn't seem to be that great. It doesn't seem to be really tailored towards people who are new to editing. It really seems to people who are like,
Advanced.
I've been editing for 40 years. I've always used Avid. This is just what I do.
Yep.
But
slide.
yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
For those, for the Mac people in the audience, we have Final Cut Pro. So this was first released in 1999, and it's currently being continuously developed by Apple. So this is Apple software. It is Mac only, which is its biggest weakness. So if you're on a PC, Final Cut is just simply not available. So it is a completely Mac only experience.
So if you were using that on a Mac, would the files you sent over not work on a PC?
Correct. So most of these editors, when you save an editing project, in order to fully save all of the different aspects of the project, each of these software has their own proprietary format. Now you can export your timelines in some standard formats like XML or EDL, or there's some standard ways of sort of encoding a timeline of where the clips are, when they're cut, and things like that. So there are some standard formats that you can use to move timelines from one software to another, but neither of them will convey the full suite of functionality. So when you export a timeline to that sort of file, there is going to be information that's lost.
Like transitions and things.
Yeah, so simple stuff will carry over, but the more complicated stuff will not.
Okay.
So you can exchange stuff between programs, but you lose stuff.
Is it possible though, then to know which things you would use just in case we were working more collaboratively on a bigger editing project. And maybe this is like thinking too outwardly. Like say like, you know, you knew we were gonna lose the color grading, but like you know, one person did like the one clips and then sent it over.
And that's a good point, because that's how they do it in the big productions, is for each individual task of the filmmaking process, they use whatever software is best. And then they just exchange it between the different softwares. So a lot of times in the big productions, they'll use Avid for the editing, as in the actual assembly, the decisions of where the cuts are going to go, how the clips are going to be assembled. That all is done in Avid. But then the final, for example, the visual effects are done in a completely different software. And so it's exported as a simple, flattened EDL they can bring into another software. And then, maybe the color grading, it'll be sent to Resolve for grading and things like that. So that is something that they do in the larger productions, is they will trade everything between different softwares. And that requires a lot of careful consideration of what your workflow is going to be, to make sure that nothing is lost that you don't want to get lost. So as an example of that, like if you're, say, going to be doing your editing in Final Cut, but then your intention is that you're going to grade everything and then export it in Resolve, well, you can do that, but you've got to just be aware. It's like, well, if I use any of like Final Cut's advanced, like fancy title tools, for example, those aren't going to carry over. So you have to save that for whatever software you're going to end up in, So you have to be just aware of what will transfer between software and what will not, when you're talking about round tripping between different softwares, which is totally a thing that you can do. But it's just important to be mindful of the limitations of it and plan for those. So Final Cut Pro, it costs $300, but that's a one-time payment. It's not a subscription currently. So it's... and $300 is a lot of money, but you do get it forever, at least currently. So I think, it is continuously updated. I don't think you have to pay for it again when it's updated. So I think you pay for it one time and then you just get it forever. At least that's the way it works right now. So I've heard that Final Cut Pro is very good. I've never used it because I'm not a Mac user. But from what I do know of it, it can be very fast on modern Macs, because one of the advantages of being constrained to the Apple ecosystem is because they control the hardware and the software. The software is very well optimized for the exact hardware that goes into a Mac. And so if you're using your workflow the way that Apple wants you to, it can be very, very fast. And you can get some great performance out of it's Apple, so it is still expensive, but not absurdly expensive hardware you can get great performance out of. So it is very well optimized for the hardware that it runs on. So that's Final Cut, which can be a great option for the people who prefer Mac, but it's not necessarily as good for people who are going to be working in a team of both Mac and PC users, because it's only on the one platform. Which is not the case for these other softwares. All of the other ones are available on Mac and Windows. So Adobe Premiere is a very popular software for productions of sort of low and mid-level, even mid to high-level productions will use Premiere. And so the biggest advantage of Premiere is that it is made by Adobe. And that means that it integrates very well with all of Adobe's other software. If you use a lot of Photoshop, Photoshop integrates great with Premiere. If you use Audition or Illustrator or After Effects or any of Adobe's Creative Suite, all of that software integrates really seamlessly with Premiere. And it has lots of great functionality where, Premiere is just their editor, but then they have After Effects for their visual effects and compositing, and you can just click one button and send a clip to After Effects, and then After Effects just opens up and it all syncs back to Premiere seamlessly. So that's a real advantage. If you're used to working with Adobe software, Premiere will work with it really well. And then the biggest con is that it's made by Adobe, which means that you better be prepared to pay $50 a month for the rest of your life, because they're not going to make it easy to cancel your subscription. They're certainly not going to sell it to you for a one-time cost. So There is a class action lawsuit ongoing about how difficult Adobe makes it to cancel your subscription. So, no, it's not class action. It's the government suing them, but whatever. Yeah, so there's a lawsuit ongoing about how difficult they make it to cancel your subscription once you sign up. So, yeah. Now, with that said, I have used Premiere a fair amount. It is fairly easy to pick up and learn. Of all of these, I would say Premiere is probably the most beginner friendly. It's probably the most accessible. It does, it does sort of, it doesn't overwhelm you with options, and I think that that's great. And it's also very customizable. You can really arrange the layout of the UI exactly how you want it, and you really can use as much of it or as little of it as you want. So it can be very powerful, but it also doesn't overwhelm you with options that you might not know how to use. So that's a real strength of Premiere. And again, it's available on Windows and Mac. It's very popular, so there's lots of people who use Premiere out there. But the software that I use and the one that I'm the biggest fan of is DaVinci Resolve. And DaVinci Resolve started out its life as dedicated color grading software. That's all it did. It was a dedicated piece of software for color grading, and that is the color correction and the aesthetic adjustment of the colors of digital footage. And once that started to become possible, thanks to digital editing and digital compositing and so forth, DaVinci Resolve was made as a dedicated program for handling your color grading and your color correction. And that's how it started out its life. And it is still the industry standard for color grading. Even at the very high level, Resolve is what they use for color grading. So even the big productions will use Resolve for their color grading work. But on top of that, it now will do editing, visual effects, sound mixing, and all the other things you want to do. So it started out just doing color grading, but over time they've integrated more and more functionality into it, where now it can be a fully featured post-production suite, and it can do the, you can make an entire film in Resolve and never leave the software. And so it's, its other categories aren't as strong as its color grading, but it's still very solid for basically everything. It may not be the best option for everything like it is the best option for color grading, but it does everything in one software. And it's free. So there is a free option for DaVinci Resolve. So they make two versions. There's DaVinci Resolve Base, which is free, and then there's DaVinci Resolve Studio, which is $300 one time. And so far it used to be $1,000, now it's $300. If you buy a camera from Blackmagic, the company that makes it, then you often get Studio for free with the camera. And the thing is, so they
good cameras.
Yeah, for filmmaking, yeah.
Okay.
So the studio version is the fully functional version, but it's shocking how few limitations there are with the free version. There's no watermarks, there's no time limits. There are limitations, but they're very reasonable and not something that you're going to have a problem with unless you're going with a more advanced workflow. Stuff like, the visual effects suite isn't as advanced in the free version. You can only do 4K timelines rather than 8K or 16K timelines. I don't think that's going to be a problem for many people.
Not for us.
So there are limitations, but there's shockingly few considering that it's totally free. And so that's another reason why I really recommend Resolve, is because it doesn't cost anything to get started with it. Now, with that said, there are downsides. It is not as beginner friendly, I found. It does look very friendly. The thing with Resolve is there are a billion settings and buttons and dials that you can do everything, but it's not always the best at prioritizing, what do we show the user, what do we not, how do we streamline things for people who are less familiar. They do have separate pages. They have a cut page and an edit page, where the cut page is more for like simple edits, and then the edit page is the more full experience, but it's not as beginner friendly, I found, but again, it's free. It's hard to beat that. It is arguably a cult, but if it is a cult, then I'm a member of it. You'll see lots of people on YouTube saying, I switched to Resolve, and I love it. So I'm a big proponent of Resolve. It's what I use, and it's what I'd recommend for anyone who's getting started mainly just because, again, it's free. So there's very low commitment. So moving on from software, I'm going to talk a bit about sort of where you might start the editing process, and that's with conforming and assembling your footage. So this is sort of just at the very beginning of the process. You've been given this big bunch of footage, and you need to start putting it together into something. So when we talk about conforming media, what do I mean? And what I mean by that is that all of your media that goes into your film, so your video clips, your audio files, your images, what have you, they're all going to be in different digital formats. And there's a ton of digital formats out there. They all have their different characteristics. But at the end of the day, your finished film is going to have a single resolution, single frame rate, color space, etc. Everything is going to be homogenized into a single format that's going to comprise your final film. And so conforming your media is going to be, how do you take your source media that's in all these different formats and so forth and consolidate it all into a single shared format that is going to be your final film. So one of the things that you might do, for example, when you're conforming media is you might say, pick your timeline resolution, because your final video is going to have one resolution, even if your source clips are all at slightly different resolutions. You're going to pick one, and then you're going to scale everything to fit that resolution. You're going to decide how you scale things, for example. That's just one of the decisions that you might be making during the conform step. You're also going to be picking a frame rate. Different video files, different formats, they'll use different frame rates. That is a different number of frames every second, because a video is just a sequence of still images played back in rapid succession, but how many images per second varies. So, but your final film is only going to have one frame rate, so you have to figure out what that frame rate is going to be, how you're going to conform everything. And then I also talk about color space stuff. This is something that is a personal interest of mine, but you can probably leave to the wayside unless you're doing some of the more advanced stuff, like if you're delivering to a theater or delivering for HDR, for example. The color space stuff starts to matter a lot, but if you just want to make something, you can probably ignore the color stuff when you're starting out. So for common formats, this part is a bit dense, but I'm just going to give sort of a brief overview just so you're sort of aware of what some of the biggest formats for films might be in this day and age. So to start off, we have HDTV / Blu-ray. So this is stuff coming from around the late aughts, into the early and mid 2010s. So for HDTV and Blu-ray, we have, this is your 1080p, 1920 by 1080 is your resolution typically. That's a resolution a lot of people are very familiar with. Typically, if you're delivering to TV or Blu-ray, you're going to have either stereo or 5.1 sound. We'll talk about what that means a little later on. You've got a number of different frame rate options. Again, these this can be a little bit hard to parse, but all I'm just trying to expose you to here is that there are different frame rates that you're going to have to be aware of and be mindful of, and you have to be especially careful about when you mix your frame rates, because when you mix them, you can end up with artifacts that you might not intend. So it's just something to be intentional and mindful about, and if people are curious about this, I can talk more about it, but I just want to sort of show you that we've got a bunch of different options here you can choose from. And then in terms of color, Rec 709 SDR, but again, you probably don't have to worry about that a whole lot to start with. Our newer format that's in the process of supplanting HDTV and Blu-ray is we have 4K Ultra HD and 4K Blu-ray. So this has 4 times the resolution, 4 times as many pixels. It's 3840 by 2160, so that just gives you more detail available in your image that you can work with. These newer formats, they'll typically provide more sound formats, more surround sound options. You'll often see these typically are sort of phasing out some of the frame rates that are associated with older CRT television and stuff like that. We're less concerned about backwards compatibility with that now because we're sort of moving into the all digital age. But this is sort of the format that you'll see a lot on streaming services today. A lot of the streaming content that's made now is made 4K Ultra HD. A lot of it is going to be HDR if you're on a Blu-ray or a streaming service. If you're talking about a big film. Online, a lot of it is still SDR, but this is sort of the newer standard that everyone's transitioning towards, slowly but surely, is 4K Ultra HD. At some point, we may have 8K become the standard, but we're not there yet. Another thing I want to just point out is there is a separate set of formats for theaters, specifically for movie theaters. And these are managed by the Digital Cinema Initiative, or DCI. And we have DCI 2K and DCI 4K. And basically what that means is for theaters, you have two different resolutions. You have your 2K and your 4K. 4K in this context means very similar to 4K Ultra HD. There's subtle differences, but basically it's your HD or your Ultra HD resolution in the theater. And then we also have two different aspect ratios for films. You might notice most films, they've got that wider screen ratio with the black bars. You also have some films that don't use the wide screen, and they're in a closer to 16:9 ratio. So you've got two resolutions at two aspect ratios, and that gives you four, frame sizes that you'll use in the theater. And this is pretty well standardized across all movie theaters, and that's just sort of why I bring it up, just to make you guys aware of sort of theaters have their own format that they're expecting. Theaters almost always provide surround sound. You don't have to make your film with surround sound, but they almost always have that as an option. And films are almost always at a frame rate of 24 frames a second. There are exceptions, but ever since the silent film era, 24 frames per second has been the standard rate for film. So if you're making a narrative film and you're unsure about the whole frame rate thing, 24 is usually a good place to start. And they have their own color science as well. So that's all a bit dense, but now we're going to get into some of the more creative stuff. So when we talk about assembly, we're talking about putting all of your clips, just arranging them. We're not worried about the fine, precise editing, the exact timing. We're just sort of trying to get everything organized and in order, and then the general structure of our film. And in this case, it's really useful to use the script. If you have, your clapper boards, people are calling out the scene and the take, that can be very helpful. Just at the beginning stage of your editing, to just get everything organized and arranged roughly in the way that it's going to be in the final film. And then, a lot of times we'll do just a rough pass where it's okay if things are kind of sloppy. We're going to go back through, we're going to refine it, but we're just trying to get everything organized at the beginning. And now we're going to move into sort of to talk more about the creative side of editing, because we've been talking a lot about the technical side, and that is important. But we also have this whole other art form of using editing to help tell a story. And that is the creative side of editing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is something called the Kuleshov effect. And this is just an example to sort of get you thinking about what creative editing can do. And this is basically a phenomenon that was noticed very early in the film era. Is it basically tells us that sequences of shots are more than the sum of their parts. And when we use our creative editing, the way that we arrange our clips, the way that we cut between things, it helps to tell the story. Editing is not just, we're going to show you what's happening in one place and then we're going to show you what's happening in another place. It can be that, but you can also use the way that you cut between things, the way that you arrange things, the way that you associate different ideas and scenes and locations with each other can help to tell the story. And as an example of this, this is an example clip from the early 20th century, and it's a demonstration of the Kuleshov effect. And what you're going to see is you're going to see a series of shots, and then you're going to see a man reacting to them. And what I want you to think about when you watch this is to try to think about what sort of emotions the man might be conveying when you see his face. So yeah, the footage is a little... Yeah. And so what you might start to notice with this, it's the same shot of the man every time. It's the exact same footage.
Right.
But the preceding shot informs how you might interpret what you're seeing. And you can start to impart some additional meaning onto this shot of the man based on what came before. You might be seeing hunger. You might be seeing sadness. You might be seeing something else in his face, but it's the exact same footage. And all of that meaning is conveyed by the association between one shot and the next shot. And so this is just a very simple example, but it just shows us that the way that we assemble footage can tell us more about a shot than just what is within the frame itself. And I have another example of this. Come on, go to the next slide, please.
Yeah, I love all that stuff. Oh, this is all super cool.
Come on. There we go. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, I'm gonna
Okay.
cry.
Okay. So we've got a case study here. So this is a scene from The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. And this is just another example of how we can use editing to tell a story. And to give some sort of context on this scene and what to sort of be looking for for anyone who's not familiar with the story, at this point we're in the Kingdom of Gondor, and we have our steward Denethor, who is sort of losing it a little bit, and he's sent his son and his son's army off to retake the city of Osgiliath that's been overrun by orcs, and they are Faramir, and they are hopelessly outnumbered. So his army is being sent to their deaths, essentially. It's irrational, it's nonsensical, but that's what Denethor wants, and that's what his son is going to do. So this army is being sent to fight a hopeless battle, and we're going to follow one of our main characters, Pippin, who's staying behind with Denethor, and we're going to see what the editing is going to tell us about what's happening here. So
needs to apologize to the world for what he did with that tomato.
That's yes,
Take.
yes. So we're gonna go ahead and watch this here, and just try to think about what the editing specifically is telling you about this scene. Good movie.
Such a good movie. That's how he wants.
No, he's the executive producer.
Can you sing, Master Hobbit?
Oh.
Well, yes. At least, well enough for my own people. But we have no songs for great halls and evil times.
And why should your songs be unfit for my halls? Come, sing me a song.
Home is behind the world ahead, and there are many paths to tread through shadow, through the edge of night, until the stars are all alight. Mist and shadow, cloud and shade, all shall fade, all shall fade.
And so what I love the most about this scene, there's a lot to love about this sequence, but in the context of editing, you'll notice we never see any of the battle. Not a single moment of it. We see the soldiers approaching, we see the orcs preparing, we see the arrow fired, and then the next shot, see the arrow, and then the red dripping down his mouth. And we see throughout, we see Denethor eating, ripping the meat, and
Cracking the bones.
And so we never see this battle in the whole movie, but the editing is telling us so much about that battle by the association of these shots, by putting these shots of Denethor and Pippin and Pippin's song interspersed with the shots of the soldiers. They're telling us so much about what these soldiers are going to go through. And with the sequence put together like this, it's completely unnecessary to actually show us any of this battle, and they don't. They just go right to the aftermath.
Saved a lot of money.
Yes, sure they did. Sure they did. So what we're getting at here is that viewers are going to impart additional meaning and nuance onto the shots based upon the context around them, and that the order, duration, and composition of shots will tell us a lot about what's happening when we're editing. And so some other examples of creative editing could be if you're editing something and then you put in a deliberate continuity break, like a flashback, for example, can tell us what the character is thinking about, or interpret the way that we, or inform the way that we interpret following shots. If you imagine, you have some character, they're thinking about a situation, and then all of a sudden you have this cut to something that happened previously. What does that tell you? It tells you that that's what that character is thinking about as they're facing the situation there and now. Or it can remind us of something that happened previously and have us thinking about that as we watch what comes after. And we can also use the speed of our editing to sort of convey a feeling. If we're cutting back and forth really fast, if we're in a fight sequence, you're going to notice really fast cuts from one shot to another. It can create intensity, it can create disorientations, and then if we use, sort of slower, more methodical cuts, it sort of implies a more relaxed or meditative environment. And so, we can not only do things with the order of shots, but we can do things with the speed of our cuts, how long we linger on any given shot before we cut away. And as another case study of how editing can help heighten a story, I think probably one of my favorite examples is Arrival. This was a movie from 2016, and it was probably the movie that I was most pleasantly surprised by. I went into it just thinking it was going to be a cheesy disaster movie about an alien invasion. It was not that at all. And so in Arrival, we start with a montage of a mother and her daughter. And we see the daughter growing up, and then we see her get cancer, and we see her die. So that's how we start the movie. So we start with, the relationship between mother and daughter, and then the tragedy of having the daughter pass away at a young age. That's how we start. And then after that, we move to the beginning of the movie, where we see the same character just going about her daily life while the news of the alien invasion the alien arrival rather is coming on the TV. And as the character goes through the daily life, they play it very flat. They're very neutral. They don't convey a whole lot of emotion in this second sequence. And what we can interpret from that is that the character is experiencing some sort of grief, right? That they're still processing what happened. And we imply that through the sequence that came before and through the neutral performance that the actor gives. And then we move on to other things. We focus more on the aliens' arrival. We focus on, learning the aliens' language. We focus on trying to understand them and seeing all the cool alien things. And we sort of forget about this.
Where did this happen?
Hey! I win! I win the pool! I win the pool!
I'm determined to get here on time.
Too bad you didn't put money on it.
I swear to God. I swear to God. It was on purpose.
Yeah. So we have our opening, we have our implied grief, and then we move on to other things, and we sort of forget about this as the audience because we're more focused on the main plot of the movie. And then as the plot goes on, we start to have these little moments of confusion because throughout we're seeing what we interpret to be flashbacks as our character is, engaged in the present moment, researching the aliens, and then we have cutaways to her and her daughter. And, through the language of film, we naturally assume that these are, flashbacks that are informing her current thinking and her current experience. But then we also have these moments of confusion. There's a conversation between two characters where she maybe implies that she's never been married before, has always been single, and we're like, wait, I thought she had a daughter. What's the deal with that? Or she maybe seems confused about the things that she's remembering. She thinks it's as though it's new information to her. There's just tiny little moments of confusion that throw us off balance. And then we get to the end of the movie and we realize what's going on and everything is recontextualized. And we discover that the story of this movie is this character beginning to experience her life non-linearly. Because in the movie, the aliens have a language that can only be spoken when you already know the conclusion of your sentence. They have a very different language and they have a very different way of thinking where to them everything happens at once. And our character is a linguist. She learns their language. She learned what?
Seems accurate.
Yeah. and she learns how to speak this language where everything is known all at once. And then at the end of the movie, we start to realize what's going on, that these flashbacks are not flashbacks, they're flash forwards. And that as she begins to understand the alien's language, she's beginning to see things from her future as though they were memories. And so the language of film that's telling us these are flashbacks, we discover these are actually flash forwards to things that haven't happened yet. She, is facing this situation where the militaries are at odds with each other, and then she has a quote-unquote flashback to a meeting with the opposing general telling her how she diffused the situation, and then she uses that to diffuse the situation. And so after we see the end of this, after we come to this realization, we go back to the montage with the daughter, and everything is recontextualized, because now we know that what we're seeing is not before the events of the movie, it's after. And that the character is going into this knowing exactly how it's going to end. But what I love so much about this movie is that it uses the language of film to trick you and to subvert your expectations. Because we assume that what happens at the beginning of the movie happens at the beginning of the story. But it doesn't. And we assume that when we have a character in the present cutting away to a different time, we assume that time's in the past. But it's not. And so it uses its editing and uses the structure and the way the story is arranged to help tell us that. Because if you imagine a version of this where they didn't have that sequence at the beginning, then the whole meaning of the whole experience of watching the movie would be different, because that first scene isn't going to be informing everything that comes after, and that realization isn't going to be nearly as satisfying. And so Arrival has a very cyclical structure to it that I really like.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, and I'll also note, this was based on a book. The book was not like this. The book was much more explicit about what was happening. This was unique to the movie, which I thought was also cool.
Very Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind kind of situation.
Yeah. So we're also going to spend some time talking about the different types of cuts that we can use. So when we're talking about cutting from one shot to another, so we're changing. Either we're just changing camera angles within a shot, within a scene, or moving from one scene to another. We're moving from one location to another, what have you. We always have to do cuts. Almost all, there are some movies that get fancy with it. They try to do everything without cutting, but, we're always going to have some sort of cuts and transitions in our film. And so it's important to know how you can get creative with your cuts. But to start with, we're just going to talk the basic cut. It's the simplest kind of transition you can possibly have. Just one frame you're on one shot, next frame you're on the next shot. That's all there is to it. And this is very simple. It works. It's a good default decision. If you don't have anything else in mind, there's nothing special you're trying to convey, the cut works. People realize very early on, You can, show people one scene and then all of a sudden be showing them a completely different scene, and people will just go with it. It's not distracting. With a basic cut, it is helpful to not break continuity if you're not trying to break continuity. Again, it's all about being intentional. If you're trying to keep people in the same place and time, then you want to try to make sure your continuity is on point. And that's both managed sort of while filming and then also in editing somewhat. Unless you're trying to make the audience confused, of course.
Unless you're David Lynch.
Yeah. But moving into some more creative types of cuts, you'll hear people talk about L and J cuts, and these refer to sort of how the video track and the audio track look on the timeline. You usually have your video on the top and then your audio on the bottom, and usually the cut of the video is aligned up with the cut of the audio, but it doesn't have to be that way. With a J cut, we have the audio from the next scene or shot that comes in before the video.
Oh, okay.
So an example of this could be if you have a dialogue scene between two characters. You have two shots. You have one that's focused on one character's face. You have the other that's cut on the other character's face, and they're having a dialogue. You'll see this happen all the time if you look for it. Character A is speaking, and then character B starts to speaking. But rather than, cutting to character B's shot, their close-up, at the same time they start speaking, we hear character A finish, we hear character B start speaking, and then a moment later we see their face.
Another great way to draw some fun parallels.
Right, it can draw parallels. It can help smooth out transitions. People are it can almost seem weird if you edit dialogue scenes without using L and J cuts, because it just seems very predictable. The moment someone starts speaking, we see them. Then the next person starts speaking, we see them. When you use L and J cuts, it can help things flow a little better. L cuts are just the opposite. It's when you have the audio from one scene or shot linger after the video is cut away to something else. You'll see this also if you're particularly if you're transitioning between scenes. You may have a character delivering some dialogue where they're talking about where they're going to go or what they're going to do next, and then we see the video of the next scene come in like right as they're finishing their sentence, and so the audio sort of lingers a bit because
So oh, sorry.
No, go
I
ahead.
asked two quick examples use for a J cut would be maybe if someone in a common one, a common trope one I think is like the sound of traffic suddenly coming in,
Yeah.
and then it cuts to them on the street.
Right,
Or,
exactly.
Then the L cut would be them telling a story, and then the story kind of fades over the
Exactly,
area of
yeah.
the thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So yeah, L and J cuts, it just refers to the way that the audio and the video sort of look on the timeline. But yeah, they help smooth out transitions, meaning they can help make transitions less jarring when you're moving from one place to another or one shot to another.
Linguistically speaking, what is fundamentally the difference between a cut and a transition?
I think the cut refers. You can use it in different contexts. I think, a transition, you can use it to refer to a way of sort of making one shot disappear and the other appear. So if you're talking about a crossfade, that's a transition.
Okay.
Or if you're talking about go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Is it a situation where every cut is a transition, but not every transition
Yes.
is a cut?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you talk about Star Wars, the wipe, that's a transition.
The wipe.
Yeah,
That's fun.
But
Too bad we could never do that.
but then
Most are doing Star Wars specifically.
yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so and then you can also think of transition in the context of we're moving from one scene to another, we're moving from one location to another, we're moving from one idea to another. You can use it in a bunch of different contexts. You can use it in the more literal sense to talk about how you're making one shot appear and the other disappear. You can also talk about how we're moving the story from one place to the next.
Right,
So you can-
and as far as our group, whereas each person's kind of taken the reins and being director and kind of
Yeah.
increasing that communication. I want to make sure that communication to that editor was, am I asking for a cut or am I asking for a transition?
Yeah,
Right,
that's a good
so
point.
it's-
That's a good point to make. Yeah.
Thank you, Colin.
So another type of cut that we use a lot is the insert. So this is often when we cut to a new shot and that presents a detail from the preceding shot more clearly. So a classic example of, let's say, you have your character in a room and there's some items on the shelf, and the character we have one shot where you see them walk up to the shelf, they look, and then we have a cut to an insert where we have the item that they're looking at in close up. So we're taking we're taking the detail that was a bit hard to make out in the wide shot, we're showing it to you more clearly. It helps the audience figure out what's important to be paying attention to. Because a lot of times when we have our, more busy shots with a lot going on, an insert can help us, focus on what we're meant to be paying attention to. And it can also help reveal additional details about the environment or about the items in the environment. Jump cut, I hesitate to call this a different kind of cut because mechanically it's the same as just a cut, but it has a different feel to it. A jump cut is when you cut to a new shot, but in the same location with the same composition and the same subject, but it's just at a slightly different moment of time. You'll see this happen a lot with talking head type shots in TV or in unscripted content, especially on YouTube or TikTok or what have you. Yeah.
For like a trophy movie version of a jump cut, would like a good version be like this example for my own understanding? Like say like it's a shot, like it's still shot of like a house, and then next thing you know it's like boom, night.
Right. Yeah. I mean, on jump cut, the thing about jump cuts is they're often done unintentionally. I see a lot on social media, people jump cut. They're filming themselves, they're talking, they need to cut for some reason, they screwed up a line of dialogue, or they're jumping to a different point in time, or what have you. And then they cut to same framing, same subject, same environment, but they're in a slightly different position because we're at a slightly different point in time. So you can see that a cut has happened, but we're not really meant to be moving from one thing to another. We're meant to be just staying on the same thing, but there's a cut just by necessity because that's how it was filmed. So they can be used intentionally. A lot of times they're used intentionally for montage. We can have montage of characters doing something, we can have a locked off shot, and then we can use fades to sort of move through time, or we can use just jump cuts. We're in the same environment, wide shot, we're just seeing them pop, around the room as they're doing things. That can work. It can be used to do a montage. It can be used if you're trying to create disorientation. You can have intentional continuity errors like that thrown in. But a lot of times these are done unintentionally, and they're best to be avoided unless you're doing them on purpose. A trick that you'll see used all the time, especially in television, if you have to cut where you're not, if you have a subject that's, say, speaking, and you have to cut, it can be helpful to cut away to a different shot, even if it's not necessarily motivated or necessary. It can be less jarring rather than doing a jump cut. Say if we have a dialogue and an actor messes up a line, but rather than re-speaking the whole line, they just re-speak part of it. So we have to have a cut in the middle there somewhere. It's a necessity. That's what the footage is, But we don't want it to have that jarring jump cut in the middle. So, we cut away to another angle of the same conversation, and then we cut back. Even if that cut wasn't necessarily, totally story motivated, it can make it less jarring for the audience. So a lot of times, jump cuts and the need to cover them up just happens by necessity of when coverage is lacking from footage. But it's something that you have to deal with. If you don't have the ability to reshoot things, sometimes, it's something you have to be mindful of and something you have to deal with. So a match cut is another kind of cut. Again, mechanically the same as a basic cut. But it's when we cut to between two shots that are similar in their composition, similar in the makeup of the frame, where the objects are, how large they are in the frame, where the camera is, how it's angled. Similar composition, but in often different environments or different times. And the example that Mackenzie gave may be more apt to call that a match cut, for example. If we're on the shot of the house and then it's daytime and then cut, same exact composition, but it's night.
Oh, okay.
And that emphasizes the change from day to night. Because we're in the same location, but we're in a different time. And it implies a connection between the two shots. Like in the house example, it implies we're staying in the same place, it's just a different time of day now, And it often is used to emphasize the things that change between shots versus the things that stay the same. Because but in a match cut, your eye is often going to stay in the exact same place that it was at before. And so it can help you, draw the viewer's eye to where you want it, help them notice what's different and what's the same. And an example, and it can create disorientation also. If a character is, suddenly transported from one location to the other, how did this happen? I'm I'm doing the same thing, but I'm in a different place now. And as an example of a match cut, we have our case study is 2001: A Space Odyssey, probably the most famous match cut. So for context on this scene, we're in the dawn of man. So we're watching a group of prehistoric pre-humans that more or less are just apes in conflict with a rival group over a watering hole. And in the preceding scenes, we've seen one of the apes that we're following discover that they can use a bit of bone as a weapon to crush skulls, to crush their enemies. They had this encounter with the alien monolith, and then now they've learned to use this bit of bone as a weapon against prey or against other pre-humans. And so in this sequence, in the shot that I'm going to show you, we've just seen the ape use this weapon to fend off this rival group, drive them away from the watering hole, and then we also, because we're nearing the end of the Dawn of Man sequence, we need to move from the Dawn of Man 10,000 years ago to the year 2001, where humanity is spacefaring and we have this orbital station and all that stuff. So there's a lot going on here because we have our context of what's going on, and then we have the need to move from one part of the movie to the other part of the movie, jumping across a huge stretch of time, jumping location, jumping characters, jumping everything. And watch how the match cut helps us have the transition and what it tells us about the transition that we're making. So what just happened there? So we had, so wish I could frame it. Stop doing that. I'm trying to frame by frame it.
Turned into a lightsaber.
Okay, trying to go frame by. No. Okay. Well, anyway, so we have this shot of the bone. It's flying up into the air.
Goes out of frame.
He goes out of frame, comes back into frame,
Where am I looking?
and then getting as close as frame by frame as I can here.
Rotational direction changes.
What?
When it goes out of frame, there's a jump cut. The rotational direction of the bone changes.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. That was probably not intentional. But yeah, so we have this shot of the bone. It's tumbling through the air, and then we have this sudden, very abrupt transition to this shot of the satellite. We're in space. We're in orbit around the Earth. We're in the year 2001. And what does this tell us? Well, we're already thinking about what this bone means to the movie. It's a weapon. That's where we're being shown. We've seen them use it to crush a skull. We've seen them use it to drive their enemies away. The bone is a weapon. The ape is throwing it up in the air. They're celebrating. And then we're cutting to 12,000 years later, this satellite in orbit. And you'll note it's a bit rough in this case, but the position in the frame of the bone and the satellite is a little bit similar. They sort of line up in that way, and so when the cut happens, your eye is already tracking the bone,
Right.
and then it's going to land right on that satellite right away. And then there's not a whole lot else going on in this frame. There's not a lot else to focus on, but your eye is going to be drawn right here, and then as the shot goes on, then we focus more on the Earth and the other satellites and so forth. But what's great about this is when this movie was in production, there was originally going to be a narration over the beginning of the 2001 portion of the movie, explaining that in the year 2001, humanity has placed nuclear weapons platforms in orbit to ensure mutually assured destruction. Now that narration is not in the final movie. It's not needed because we have this match cut here from humanity's first and most primitive weapon to humanity's ultimate weapon, the nuclear bomb. And so there's a whole lot of subtext that's conveyed in the cut here. We're thinking about the bone, we're thinking about the weapon, and then now we're looking at this satellite. What does that tell us about the satellite? It's a weapon. And all of that connection is implied just by this cut. And you can imagine if you're the editor on this movie, it would be very easy to just wrap up the Dawn of Man sequence, wind it down, fade out, fade in, we're in space, and a narrator explains this all to us. Or you can do it this way and convey all of that in subtext through this one cut. And mechanically, it's just a cut. That's all there is to it, and it conveys all of that subtext. And so that's another example of how a cut can tell us so much about what's happening in the story of the movie. Come on, here we go. Any questions so far? We're moving to sound. A lot of ground we're covering. Okay.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, sound mixing. So we talked a lot about the video. Sound is equally important, if not more important, to a film. So usually we do audio after we've sort of figured out the visuals. We do our sound mixing. And, it goes without saying that music and sound effects add a whole lot to the story. I'm not a music guy. That's not, we have someone else who's going to tell us about sound mixing. But just in the context of editing, it's just something to sort of give an overview of. There's the creative side of sound mixing, of course, with, our sound design, what sound effects are we using, how are we mixing them together, what sort of effects are we putting on them. What is our music going to be like? How is the music going to inform the viewer's emotions? And then, of course, we also have sort of the more mundane side of it of, we have some audio that doesn't sound great. Let's clean it up, So a lot of times we're using digital manipulation, digital effects to make dialogue more intelligible, make sounds clearer, remove, unwanted artifacts and glitches from the audio. We're also going to be giving some attention to the volume. We want to avoid any, jarring shifts in volume when that's not what we're going for. A jarring shift in volume can be used to tell the story, but if we're not going for that, then we don't want, someone to be talking like this and then they're talking like this suddenly, we don't want that. So, we pay some attention to volume, we pay attention to, cleaning the sounds, we pay attention to what sort of music and sound effects we're adding. So, I think we have another lesson that's being planned to talk about sound specifically. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. I'm going to spend some time talking about sound mix formats because I mentioned that earlier when I was talking about the different delivery formats that we have. But this is pretty simple. So the most simple kind of sound mix you can have is a mono mix where it's just a single sound channel. It's just one track of sound, all of your music, sound effects, your voice, everything. It's just one unified audio track. And the thing about mono is it doesn't convey any directional information to the viewer. The sound is just what it is. We don't have any idea where the sound is coming from except what's implied by the visuals. So we can't tell if it's coming from the left or the right, the front or the back, the top or the bottom. We have no idea. It's just mono. And so to help improve that, to help improve the immersion of a movie-going experience, we have stereo sound. Stereo is probably the most common format for sound these days. This is where we have separate soundtracks for the left and the right speakers. The left and right speakers are playing totally different sound files. And this allows us to convey basic directional information. If a character exits left in the frame, you can have their voice move more towards the left speaker, and you can hear their voice moving off to your left, things like that. We also have surround sound, the most basic form of that being 5.1. 5.1 sound, that notation refers to the number of speakers. So 5.1 means we have 5 ordinary speakers and then 1 subwoofer that's dedicated for low frequency sounds. Surround you'll find a lot in movie theaters. With surround we have a dedicated center channel. So we have the left and the right for conveying sounds coming from the left and the right, and then we have the center for things that are just coming out of the screen, that are just what we're seeing in the middle of our field of vision. We have the center channel to help make that audio more distinguishable from stuff that's meant to be coming from the left or the right. And then with surround we also have rear speakers in addition to our front speakers, so that we can hear sounds coming from all around us. If we want to improve our immersion by making something sound like it's coming from behind you, in addition to being implied, to be behind the camera, you can have the sound come from behind you, or you can have it circle around you, or whatever you want. And then surround, we have our dedicated subwoofer. You ever notice that in the movie, those big booms and those big, rumbles, those hit way harder in a theater because they have a dedicated low frequency channel for that. There's a variation on surround 7.1 that adds 2 more speakers. You have your front, your side, and your rear. So it sort of differentiates the rear from the side, and so you have a bit more separation, just slightly better quality. If you ever hear streaming services or TVs or soundbars talk about Dolby Atmos or DTS:X, it's a buzzword you'll see a lot. These are formats that they don't split things up into a specific number of sound tracks. Rather, they record different sounds and where they're coming from in 3D space, and then whatever is playing the Atmos will handle the mixing down to whatever speaker configuration you have. So you can go to watch a movie in a Dolby Cinema with, their 11 channels of surround sound, and they're playing, an Atmos file, and their player is figuring out where to put all the sounds on all the different speakers. And then you can play that exact same sound file on a stereo sound bar, and it'll figure it out. So those are standards that are designed to make audio a bit easier to adapt to different formats. So they dynamically adjust to speaker configurations. They also allow for height information. Some theaters have speakers in the ceiling now, so they can have sounds coming from above you specifically. On the topic of sound mixing, something that we do a lot is we clean dialogue. If we have someone who's supposed to be speaking, we want their voice to be intelligible. Again, Christopher Nolan could use some pointers on this. But we want we want to make someone's dialogue more intelligible. That can involve using filters to remove unwanted background noise. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you want that background noise. One thing that we do sometimes is we use EQ, that's equalization, and this is a form of digital manipulation to the sound, basically boosting the sound frequencies that are pleasant to the ear and then suppressing the ones that aren't. The human voice, the sound of the human voice is comprised of a whole bunch of different frequencies of sounds that are all overlapping with each other and commingled. And depending on the speaker, depending on the microphone, depending on the room, you can have some sort of frequencies that end up sounding harsh. And it's hard to describe objectively what I mean by harsh, but if you listen to examples, you'll know what I mean. And these sorts of harsh frequencies can slip into sound a lot. It can be hard to sort of notice them when you're not specifically trying to draw them out, but usually with equalization, we're trying to identify, what sort of frequencies are sounding good, what sort of frequencies make the voice sound better, and which ones make it sound worse, which ones are harsh. So there's usually an EQ step, and again, I'm not going to go into this in super fine detail, but just sort of pointing it out as a thing that exists. We also have compression. So compression means something different in the context of audio. When we talk about videos or images, when we say compression, we often mean data compression. Trying to reduce the file size or the bandwidth of a file. But in the context of audio, when we say compression, we mean something different. We mean reducing the range of volume. So if you have an audio file and you use compression on it, basically what you're saying is you're taking the quiet parts and you're making them louder, but keeping the loud parts the same volume, or you're taking the loud parts and making them softer and keeping the quiet parts the same volume. And so it reduces the range of volume. So if you have somebody who, maybe speaking a little loudly and they're speaking quietly, some people's voices are very flat, they're very neutral in volume, they stay the same volume. Other people, just depending on how they talk, their voice varies a lot in volume, one moment to the next. That's just how it just varies by the person. And sometimes you use compression to try to reduce that variation if you don't want it there.
We'll listen by one real quick. Okay, so if anyone comes in, we let them know.
Okay.
That.
Yeah.
I didn't know I could buy Sean just told me that was the thing I should do. I was like, oh, I should just I'll just I'm gonna leave that doesn't play. I've been here for like a week. I would have gotten that last week. It was so bad.
So on the subject of volume, something that's relatively easy to start doing that can make a big difference. Maybe less so when we're publishing to social media, but this goes back to what I was talking about avoiding unwanted shifts in volume. And if you've ever, I'm sure a lot of people have had the experience where you're watching one thing on your TV, you set the volume to a comfortable level, then you start watching something else, either a different show or within the same show, and then now the volume is unpleasantly loud or unpleasantly soft, you know?
Especially if some ominous or something's going on, usually it starts getting loud.
Yeah, and you know, so there's an element of how much variation do we want, right? And that is a very subjective thing. Sometimes we want there to be, maybe our dialogue seems to be a little bit softer, so that way when the loudness comes in, it makes much more of an impact. Or if we're not trying to give that sort of impact, we want maybe things to be a bit more even. That's again, it goes back to the story. And then it also depends on the viewer. Some people find shifts in volume very unpleasant. Some people don't mind them, I went to go watch Dune 2 in an IMAX theater. Oh my God. That was so loud. It was rough. Yeah, so normalizing volume, basically, when I talk about normalization of audio, I'm less so talking about the variations in volume within a film, and more so the overall loudness of the film as a whole. And so you can have whatever amount of volume variation within your film that you want, but that sort of leaves the question, okay, well, I know that I want, my, battle sequence to be this many times louder than my dialogue scene that came before, but like in absolute terms, how loud should it be? And so when we talk about normalizing volume, we're talking about how do we decide the overall loudness of our film. And when we talk about volume, there's a few different ways of expressing volume. A lot of times what you'll see in your editor is a value in dB or decibels, and that's a very literal, absolute expression of volume. That's literally the intensity of the sound, the intensity of the signal, the intensity of the vibrations of the air, right? So it's very absolute, it's very objective. We also have this other measure of volume, and that is LUFS. And LUFS refer to loudness, because the thing is that the human hearing, we don't treat all frequencies of sound and all kinds of sound the same. And some frequencies of sound will sound louder to us, even if their absolute intensity is the same. And so this was a problem that engineers needed to solve. An example of this could be like in broadcast television. There was a thing that the people who made the commercials would always want their commercials to be louder than the show. And we wanted to crack down on that. And so we said, okay, well, your commercial has to be the same volume as the show. It's like, well, what do you start doing? Well, you use the sound frequencies that people are going to interpret as louder, that people are going to perceive as louder. You use more of those. You use, maybe higher pitch or lower pitch or what have you. You change your sound so that you increase the perceived loudness, even if the absolute intensity is the same. So we come up with this loudness scale to help us sort of try to quantify the way that our ears and our brains will interpret the loudness of a sound, irrespective of its literal intensity. So decibels refer to the raw amplitude of the sound. A bit strangely, in the context of video, the volume in decibels starts at 0 and goes down. I don't know why. But 0 decibels is the loudest that anything can get, and then you go down to -10, -20, -30 decibels. I don't know why it is that way, but usually when you're working with video, if a sound that was a book falling.
Ghosts.
Ghosts.
It was the ghost.
That was loud. Yeah, speaking of loud. So
both or was that, do you think?
So one thing to know about when talking about sound in decibels, if a sound's raw volume in decibels, if it exceeds 0, then it will be clipped and all information will be lost. So if you have because if you have somebody speaking and then, they start talking a bit louder and then their voice starts to exceed that 0 decibel threshold, what you're going to have is that everything above 0 dB in its intensity is just going to be set to 0 dB. And so you have this flat cutoff where you lose all variation, all information, all detail in the sound. And that's what you get. And this can happen on the microphone side, it can happen on the video side, it can happen on the playback side. But if your sound exceeds 0 decibels, then the information is going to be lost. So you always want to make sure that you don't exceed what your hard limit is there. Because if you do, then things are going to start to sound bad. And clipping just sounds bad. There's not really any situation where you want something to be clipping on purpose. So there's a slight variation of decibels. True peak. It's more to do with speakers. Because they do digital to analog conversion, and then the analog amplitude can be slightly higher. True peak, it's mostly the same thing as decibels. It's just slightly different because of how speakers work. You don't need to worry about that a whole lot. But yeah, like I was saying, LUFS refer to loudness, and these are usually more useful than decibels when they're trying to decide the overall loudness of our content. And different platforms, depending on where you're delivering to, they have different expectations about how loud your content is going to be. So I got some examples here. So in broadcast television, for example, there are regulations that require that the content not exceed a certain loudness. If you're on I think the exact level varies depending on where you live. But for example, if, in broadcast television, if your true peak intensity in decibels exceeds -1, it's going to be clipped. If your loudness exceeds -23 LUFS also start at 0 and go down. If your loudness exceeds -23, then you could get into regulatory trouble. Or if you're giving it to a TV station, they're going to say, we can't accept this, it's too loud. So that's a lot of time that's regulated by the government, because again, you don't want your commercials to be 10 times as loud as your content, so nobody can exceed this volume or it's not allowed.
They would if they could.
They would if they could, exactly. Netflix, for example, they want their true peak to be -2 decibels, loudness to be -27. YouTube tends to want things a bit louder. So as an example of sort of how this can work in practice, if you publish a video to YouTube, and the loudness of the whole video, measured across the entire content, exceeds -14 LUFS, they will turn your video down until it hits that level. And sometimes it's fine, and sometimes they do things to your sound that you might not want. So just as something to be aware of, if you deliver to YouTube, if you want something to be quiet, it can always be less than -14. You can always produce something that's quieter, and it'll play back as quieter. But if you make it too loud, they'll turn it down to all the same volume. And so this is, and unfortunately, in theaters, unlike most things, there's no exact standard for how loud things can be. It depends on the theater. And that kind of sucks. But yeah, so it's something to be mindful of. It usually, when I do it, it's something as I just a final sanity check. Once I've done my my sound mixing, I'll measure the loudness of the content and make sure that it doesn't go above what my platform is expecting. So if I'm going to YouTube, I don't want it to exceed -14. Another thing I do in Resolve, there's a tool you can take a bunch of dialogue or stuff that's about to be all the same volume. You can say just click on it all and say normalize the volume. Normalize this all to -14, and it'll analyze all the audio. It'll adjust the volume of every clip until it hits that same loudness. So there are normalization tools in NLEs to automate this. So you can use software to sort of just make the adjustments for you. So one of the last things we're going to talk about is delivery. So in the context of editing, we talk about delivery, we're talking about delivering the final product to whoever is supposed to be receiving the final product. So exporting. So once you have your film all assembled in your editing software, ultimately what you're going to be creating and delivering to whoever you're making the film for, whether it's for yourself or whoever, is you're going to be creating one or more finished video files that you're going to send to whatever service is publishing the content. And as with many things, these video files come in a lot of different formats. So different places will expect your deliverable to be in different formats. For example, if you're delivering to YouTube and social media, we have video formats like H.264 and H.265. These are formats that a lot of cameras can shoot right now. They're very efficient ways of encoding video. That's what you may be delivering to YouTube, for example. So if your editing software tells you, okay, well, we're going to deliver things, what format do you want to deliver in? Here's 10,000 options. You know,
It's dizzying.
Yeah, it's dizzying, and you don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs of how exactly every format works and what the differences are, as long as you know sort of what the platform might be expecting. And so YouTube, for example, you're often delivering H.264, H.265. Theaters have their own special format. So if you're delivering to a movie theater, a lot of theaters these days, they'll let you just like pull up a Blu-ray or something on your laptop or a YouTube video. But when the big studios deliver to movie theaters, they have their own special format called a DCP, which is a digital cinema package. And that's just a specially formatted collection of files for a movie theater specifically. We have other codecs, like you may have heard Apple talk about ProRes. That's a very useful way of encoding files. The files are bigger, but they're higher quality. When you're delivering, you may also be creating thumbnails or posters. You may have somebody else that's working on that independently of you, but a lot of times when I edit stuff for myself, I usually just make the thumbnails last, which I know is not the best way to do it, but it's how I do it.
Sounds like a good final step.
Yeah,
it's like it's not ripping on the path.
I mean, some YouTubers will start with the thumbnail and title and then figure out the video from there.
Of course.
Good night.
You have a good night, Jen.
And then another thing that we do when we're close to finalizing the film, we sometimes will create subtitles. Subtitles are really good for accessibility for people who are hard of hearing or deaf. And they're actually really easy to make these days. I'm going to mention an actually good and productive use of artificial intelligence, which is rare. There are tools now.
Yeah, my software, my editing software does that.
Yeah, you can just feed the audio into it. A lot of times it's built into the editing software. There's also dedicated platforms that'll do it for you. You can just feed them the audio and they'll make subtitles for you. Wow. And then you can just go through and manually check everything. I know when I edit in DaVinci Resolve, what I do is they have an option where you can just create subtitles from the audio. And so once the audio is finished, I say, hey, create subtitles from audio. It makes them all, and then I go through and I manually check them to make sure it did a good job. But you don't have to manually go through and type out every line of dialogue. Subtitles, they're good for accessibility, and they're not that hard to make these days. They've gotten a lot easier to make, a lot cheaper to make. So there's less and less reasons to not do it. Yeah. So we're reaching the end here. So for more resources, if anything, I know there's a lot of things that is sort of skimmed over without talking about in a whole lot of detail. So if anything is interesting that you want to learn more about, I'm going to recommend two channels. One of them is mine and one of them is not mine.
Yours is definitely yours.
So I have a YouTube channel. It's called Videotech Explained, and I've been working on it for a few years. And again, my interest mostly lies in the nerdy, technical, computery type stuff that goes into filmmaking and video making. And I have a lot of videos on my channel where I sort of dive deep into all the technical nitty-gritty stuff.
YouTube channel?
What?
Sorry, is that a YouTube channel?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Videotech Explained is my channel. I don't work on it as much as I used to because I'm a lot more busy now. I made a grand total of one video last year, but it was a 38-minute video, with green screen and everything. And then another channel that I liked for learning about editing, there's a guy called Taryn Van Hemert. He used to be an editor for a popular YouTube channel. He does a lot of good videos. He's focused on Adobe Premiere for editing, but he does a lot of stuff about the more practical side of editing, of attention to detail with how to do things in Premiere the best, how to maintain your technical accuracy and stuff like that. So that's also a really good resource. Earlier today, I was watching a 4-hour video from him about transitions. So yeah, so there's that. So that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to talk about or clarify or anything like that?
So you use DaVinci for everything. So the software to clean dialogue. You use DaVinci to
I
clean
use
dialogue?
DaVinci. So DaVinci. There was a program called Fairlight that was dedicated audio software that has since been integrated into Resolve.
Okay.
So Resolve has sort of become a hodgepodge of different softwares that have all been merged together. There used to be, so there was a software called Fairlight. It was used for dedicated sound mixing. It was a dedicated digital audio workstation for sound mixing. And then Blackmagic, who makes DaVinci Resolve, they bought it and then they just put it into Resolve. So it's just a tab on the bottom. You just click it, bam, you're in Fairlight.
Okay.
And then similarly, Resolve has software called Fusion for visual effects and compositing built in. It's sort of their equivalent of After Effects. So Fusion also used to be a standalone software. Now it's just baked into Resolve. Yeah.
Do you understand how to use each of the individual other softwares? Do those other features, is it easier to do it on DaVinci?
Yeah, I mean, like with most things, I mean, once you learn one editing software, it's a lot easier to pick up another one. Because all the concepts are the same, just the UI and the way things are labeled and organized might be a little different. But, once you learn one editing program, it's a lot easier to pick up another if that's what you want. I mean, because I started, what have I edited on? I've edited on Windows Movie Maker for a long time. I've edited on Sony Vegas. I've edited on this software called HitFilm. I've edited on Premiere for a while, and then I've been on Resolve for going on 3 years now. So, yeah.
All right, Camon, you're the man. That was stellar. That was absolutely stellar.
Very depth, yeah.
That was fantastic.
Thank you. Will this be up on YouTube then?
Yes. Well, so